Hi guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today I just wanted to do a video that I've been really wanting to do for a very long time, and it's about the story of how I became an atheist. And essentially, to give a bit of context, normally people don't turn atheist overnight. So I normally get asked by a couple of people, like, what are your beliefs? Eventually, that conversation comes up. And here in Kenya, it's a country that's 80% Christian and like 13% Muslim or Islam. So essentially, there are always those questions of, oh, what are your beliefs? And they're like, what? You're atheist? Why? Why don't you believe in God? And it's usually not a 20-second answer, because for most people, whatever their beliefs are, they don't happen overnight. It's not really like someone is like wakes up one day and suddenly they're like, well, don't believe in God anymore. It's not really that simple. All right, so I'll just get right into it. I grew up in a very religious household, and the period I remember in my life that pertains to my journey towards atheism is mainly starting at age 12 until age 16. So in the household that I grew up in, that was very religious. It was mainly my mom that was very religious. She was a strong, devout Christian. In terms of the church that I went to, it was founded by three denominations: Methodist, Anglican, and Presbyterian. So that's the branch of Christianity that we ascribed to at the time. But to give a bit of context with my mom, like, essentially she was so religious, like, to the point where the only things she would watch is Christian media and the news. She wouldn't watch like any secular movies, she wouldn't listen to any secular music, and she wouldn't drink any alcohol. And she would participate in church quite often, because we did live quite close to church. So of course, being brought up, she would always invite me to watch sermons with her. And there was a point I knew like pretty much majority of the preachers which you see on TV. So there was a point where there were like 24 of them, like I knew offhand, like I knew about the different preachers and what their message was about. People like Andrew Womack, Andre and Jenny, Benny Hinn, Joel Austin. Two of my favorites were actually Mike Murdoch, who talk about like the prosperity gospel, and John Maxwell, who talk about leadership. I still think some of what they say is still valid. And yeah, essentially, Creflo Dollar, John Hagee, who talk about not John Hagee, but Jack Van Impe, who talk about end times, and Joel Austin is more about like positivity when it comes to making it in life. So I knew a lot about these preachers, and I knew a lot about what their message was. And the setting that was in the church that I would attend, it wasn't just like a service, it was more of Bible study. So they group you like in age groups, like maybe class 1 till 4, class 5 and 6, 7 and 8, and then all the high schoolers are grouped in one group, and then the people in uni are in another group. So what would happen is there would be a facilitator, and there would be a set book that we would use, and you'd be in those groups. So again, the time when I was like age 12 to 16, that's when I was in two of these groups. Like there was the one just before high school and the high school group. So that's when the conversations got a bit deeper, but essentially it was very free flowing and actually quite philosophical, because essentially the facilitator would do just that. You'd facilitate and you wouldn't really talk that much, only to ask questions. So the set book would have a quote from scripture, and then maybe it would also have its own message. So it'll say like, oh, what does the Bible say about marriage, or what does the Bible say about being a good neighbor, or what does the Bible say about not doing drugs? Like, sometimes it's not really a direct comparison, but you'd have Bible verses that Christians use. I mean, they still try to make a 2,000-year-old book relevant in today's age. Yeah, though technically there's nothing wrong with that. So yeah, it was very open-minded because it was more of us discussing, and I feel that kind of allowed me to question more, though of course the questioning was limited, because at the end of the day the only conclusion is believe in God and follow the Bible, right? And I think there are a lot of misconceptions about people who are not Christians and who are non-believers that we had, that I had as well. So I was really stuck in my faith. And one of the things that made me stick to my faith is eventually I'd heard about Pascal's wager when I was about 16. So Pascal's wager was saying that he basically says if you have a Christian and an atheist, for the Christian, if he's right, he goes to heaven. If he's wrong, then nothing, you're just dead. For the atheist, if he's right, then he's just dead, but if he's wrong, then he goes to hell. So I wasn't actually willing to question my beliefs because I didn't really see the point in it. I'm like, okay, yeah, I could be wrong. I'm a Christian, I could be wrong, but there's no downside to being wrong. Also, I thought. But eventually, what happened was I actually used to prefer the American preachers so much that I told my mom, I'd rather just stop going to church and focus on listening to these guys at home on TV, because, in those days, there wasn't really like Netflix or anything, so you couldn't like pre-record and stuff like that, and I didn't know how to like pre-record stuff or anything. So yeah, I wanted to watch it the same time it was broadcasting, and at first she was resistant to the idea, but she eventually accepted it and she allowed me to stay home and avoid church. So when I was about 16, I stopped going to church, and for the next 3 years I started questioning more and more and more. Since I was outside of church, I had different perspectives from different people, started reading about different religions and different cultures, and I wasn't even trying to disprove my beliefs. I told you I believed in Pascal's wager. I was just mainly trying to learn, just acquire new knowledge and new information. But the more information I acquired, the more I started to disbelieve Christianity. So I remember when I first went to uni, I was studying a course in psychology. I didn't finish it, but I'd started, and one of the electives we did was, I think, world civilization. And there were two things that stood out. The first one that stood out is when we're learning about Jesus. People are like, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead and he came back to life and ascended into heaven, is what they essentially said. So there's no way that couldn't be real, right? But essentially I learned that when it comes to Islam, they don't actually believe that he died on the cross. They believe that a lookalike took his place, someone who looked like him died on the cross, and then Jesus just came a few days later and said he had risen from the dead. So when that was said, I was like, okay, that's actually a whole lot more plausible than someone rising from the dead, and it's conceivable that something like that could happen. Now, after more research, I do believe Jesus did die on the cross. I don't think he rose from the dead. Excuse me. I think he was just thrown in a mass grave. There's a good video by Paulo Gia who has explained why the resurrection didn't happen. I'll link that in the description. But essentially, it was about coming up with more and more plausible explanations for what could have happened throughout the Bible. And then the other thing is, like, you hear about religions and you're like, wow, Christianity has been there for 2,000 years. If you want to count it technically from the time of Genesis, you would say, oh, it's been there for like about 3,000 or 4,000 years. So, there's no way it can be wrong. If people have believed this thing for that long, there's no way it can be wrong. It must be true. But then I realized Egyptian mythology had also been there for about 4,000 years. So you must imagine, like, when those Egyptians were like on the thousandth year, they were thinking, oh, it's been 1,000 years, there's no way we could be wrong. And then another 1,000 years passes by and they're like, oh, it's been 2,000 years, there's no way we can be wrong. And then another 1,000 and another 1,000. So essentially, just because a religion lasts a long time doesn't mean it's true, because even the Egyptians and other religions like Zoroastrianism and other world religions like Hinduism have been around for a long time, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're true, right? And then the other thing is that people's religion is just determined largely by where they're born. So it's like, what if I was born in India, or what if I was born in the Middle East? I mean, I really doubt I would have been Christian. So is it just dumb luck that I happen to be born into the right religion coincidentally? Or are religions more likely to be made up? Because if there was a God, why would he allow people to just be born into a random religion that isn't the correct one? Because they can't all be correct unless you believe Baha'i faith, but that's another story. So that was yet another reason for when I started questioning my beliefs. And just when I was reading on other fields of knowledge, like concepts of isolation and believability, in the sense that, for example, if you want to get to know someone, they say it's better for you to invite them to your event. Like if you're having a party, you should invite them rather than go to their party, because if you invite them, they'll be isolated in the sense that they don't know anyone except you, so they're more likely to want to talk to you. But if you go to their party, then essentially they'll have many options of who to talk to, while you won't have many options yourself. So with Jesus telling all his disciples to leave everything behind and follow him, I found that to be a bit cultish. Like, why do they have to leave everything behind? Like, that just isolates them from the rest of society and makes them dependent on him, right? So that was just more and more, the more I read about things, I kept questioning. And the next thing I'll talk about is blessings and curses, as well as circular reasoning. So, for example, when someone prays to God, they say that if their prayer comes true, they're like, oh, congratulations, God is wonderful, God is amazing, he granted my wish or my prayer, he answered my prayer. But if it doesn't come true, it's like, oh, trust God's timing, you don't know what he has in store for you, it's all according to God's plan. So essentially, according to Karl Popper, such a circular reasoning or way of belief lacks falsifiability, because it's like there's basically no way to prove that he's wrong, because either he answered your prayer or it's not according to his will. In that case, you could replace God with anything. You could replace God with a toaster, a planet, a dragon, a fairy, and if you're to pray to that fairy or that dragon or that planet under the same pretense, it's the same outcome. Pray to Eric the toaster. If he grants your wishes, congratulations, he's all powerful. If he doesn't, then it's not according to his will. So yeah, people who believe in prayers getting answered, I think they're not really considering that it lacks falsifiability, and that's important to have in any theory if you want it to be correct. And the next thing I'll talk about is with blessings is people don't understand the difference between impossible and improbable, because when they say a miracle happens, they're like, oh, I got into a car accident and it was a miracle, I got out without a scratch. Or they'll say, oh, I had this disease and the doctor said I wouldn't make it, but oh, it's a miracle, I recovered. I think there's a difference between improbable and impossible. So improbable just means there's a low chance of it happening, but impossible is something like truly it defies the laws of physics. So to me, that's how I would define a miracle, or that's what would convince me it's a miracle. If it's something that defies the laws of physics, like let's say you're falling from a skyscraper and you just stop midair. Like midair, you just stop and you start floating. That would be a miracle to me. Or if someone was to lose both their legs, like both their legs got amputated and they grow both of them back. I didn't do biology in high school, but I don't think people can regrow limbs, at least not yet. So to me, that would be a miracle. But most people confuse the improbable for the impossible. So in my book, miracles don't exist, right? And then there's just the story of Genesis, where it says the sun, moon, and stars were created on the fourth day, but we know that the sun is older than the earth, and that didn't happen, and there's no way you can look around that. Like it doesn't make sense at all. And in terms of human beings, like where would the source of light be for them to have lived on Earth without the stars? So it just defies planetary formation, right? So if you look at the book of Genesis, it's not really accurate in terms of how the world was created. And I don't know why most Christians overlook it, because everyone is like, oh, the Big Bang, no one knows what caused the Big Bang, or the Big Bang doesn't make sense, and they try to say, oh, God created the Big Bang and stuff like that. I'm like, fine, you know what, who knows, maybe a God did create the Big Bang, but it sure as hell wasn't the Christian God, because you can't use science on one hand to say that God created the Big Bang, yet on the other hand, that same science says the sun came before the earth. right? And Revelations also talks about stars falling from the sky, and people didn't know that stars were actually, the size of the sun. So yeah, though the Christians will try and argue and they'll try and say, oh, Genesis is just metaphorical, it doesn't really matter, that people as long as Jesus resurrected, that's the true part, but Genesis is metaphorical. And to me, that's total BS. In fact, I think the hottest part of hell should be reserved for people who say the Bible is metaphorical, because for centuries, people were executed by the church for questioning the narrative in Genesis. And now all of a sudden, because science has proven them wrong, rather than changing and accepting it, they suddenly decide to say, oh, the Bible is metaphorical, right? So I could go on and on into more and more reasons as to why I started to think Christianity was false. But I would boil it down to the main reason that I wanted to get into, which is free will. Right? So essentially, I started to ask myself, if there was such a thing as a higher being, not necessarily a god, but let's say an alien or something, how would it treat a lower being? And there's no way we can ascertain how a higher being would act, but we can observe ourselves as higher beings and see how we treat lower beings. So for example, a lion eats antelopes, right? So would you kill a lion for eating an antelope? Like if you had sheep in your backyard and you decided to keep an antelope, if you had sheep in your backyard and you decided to keep a lion there, are you really going to blame the lion if it eats the sheep and you put no barrier towards protecting the sheep from the lion, right? Or if your dog chews on your slipper, are you going to shoot your dog just because it chews its slipper? Or do you have the mental capacity to realize that these lesser beings, these lower beings, are not as intelligent as you, therefore cannot be held to the same standard? So essentially, that's my view of how it doesn't make sense how God views sin, in the sense that a lot of sins would just be seen as human nature, right? So why would God create us with a nature of sin and yet punish us for it? I can give you an example. So, like you're told that sex outside of marriage is a sin. Then the question is, why do people reach sexual maturity at age 13? Like when you're a teenager, that's when you're capable of reproduction. And why is it you don't find your soulmate at age 13? Right? If God truly wanted a world where no one was having sex outside of marriage, then wouldn't he have made it such that at age 13 everyone would find their soulmate, so they would get married and they wouldn't have to have sex outside of marriage? Another example is like, for example, theft. There's a lot of poverty in the world, and that's where a lot of theft occurs. So if God didn't want people to steal, what makes more sense? Do you punish people for stealing, or do you improve the economy? Again, it's about reasoning as a higher being looking at a lower being. So for example, if you have a dog and it chews on your shoes, do you put your shoes on a higher shelf, or do you punish the dog for biting your shoes? Do you like cut off its leg because you're like, yeah, you're gonna go to hell for not for chewing on the shoes? In this case, chewing on the shoes is the sin, cutting off its leg is the punishment, putting the shoes on a higher place is actually solving the problem as opposed to making the situation worse. So I don't think a higher being would do that. In other words, Christianity sets impossible standards when it comes to sin, because there's no one who stopped sinning, right? There's no one who's like, yeah, I stopped sinning in 2008, so I've just been living sin-free for all this time. No one does that. So is it really sin, or is it just human nature, in the sense that a God has the ability to change the world to make it such that it wouldn't be sin? You understand what I mean? And some of you might say, oh, but we don't understand how God works or the nature of God, or you can't understand God's mind. But that's just the perspective of some Bronze Age or Iron Age sheep herders who wrote the Bible. So essentially, why should we take their word over ours? In other words, they're assuming the very thing that they're trying to prove. In other words, it's just Christian theologists who've told you that you can't understand how God works, but that's not been ascertained as a fact, right? I'm arguing the opposite, that we may not be able to understand how a being of infinite knowledge would act, but basically we can understand how a higher being would act, and we can rationalize that to say that it would probably be similar. And if you're to disagree with that, then it could be applied to any religion, or it could be applied to any object. Again, I could say there are fairies or dragons that exist and they control the universe, but you never see them, and they're responsible for everything. I could come up with a crazy narrative, and you could ask the same questions of why do they allow suffering, why did they create us, and I'm like, we just can't understand their nature. So that's the problem with Christianity, is that a lot of it has been refuted by either philosophy or science. And for anything that hasn't been refuted by philosophy or science, it can be applied to any religion that can even be made up. And then there's the concept of free will, and that was the final nail in the coffin for me. So with free will, essentially, I would ask myself, like, if you're given two options, okay, there are many views of free will. There's the compatibilist view of free will, and there's absolute free will, and there's determinism. These days I don't believe in free will, but even from a compatibilist view of free will, here's the question. If someone gives you two options instead of four options, do you have more or less free will? Because technically the more choice you have, the more freedom, right? And freedom equates to free will. So if you are given more choices, you'd have more free will. So why is it people essentially Adam was given the quote-unquote choice? Like when you ask Christians about the justification for everything, like why is there evil, why is there so much bad in the world, why doesn't God answer prayers, it all boils down to testing your faith. God wants you to choose him over the devil, right? But my question is, why can't you choose neither? Or why can't you choose, for example, to not believe in God and still go to heaven? Or why couldn't Adam have chosen to both eat the fruit and go to heaven? In the sense that if the whole point of putting that apple in the Garden of Eden was to give Adam free will, then why wasn't he given more options? Because we've said that more options equals more free will. He could have been given the option to stay on earth and not go to heaven. He could have been given the option of, okay, yeah, still going to hell, or going to heaven while still eating the fruit. Right? If human beings now were given the choice and they were told, you can believe in God, but if you don't believe in God, you won't go to hell, wouldn't that be better for God, in the sense that it would show that the Christians truly love him because there's no consequence for them not believing, that they're actually choosing him as opposed to being held at gunpoint? Because Christianity is this mix of love and fear, where they say, oh, God loves you, but if you don't love him back, then he sends you to hell, right? And the other question is, do people really deserve to go to hell just for not believing? Does the punishment really fit the crime? Like, essentially, we're told that we're all sinners simply because of Adam. But in reality, if your dad was a murderer, does that mean you should get arrested? Even by our own standards of how we make the law today, that doesn't happen, right? So once you understand that there is no free will, in that case, that there could have been more options, then essentially you realize Christianity is false, because it was an arbitrary choice. And we've already said that if you disagree that the arbitrary choice doesn't make sense by saying we can't understand how God works, then I would say that applies to all religions, even the made up ones. So the situation in the Garden of Eden did not make sense, and the situation with the resurrection did not make sense, because people were not given the option to just not believe and not have anything bad happen to them. And they say, they're like, oh, but evil has to be punished. Then that's circular reasoning, because you're saying evil exists in the world to give people free will, but at the same time, evil has to be punished. But if they had free will, why can't they choose to not be evil, or choose to be, or choose to be born like without being evil? You get it? It's a very binary choice when there should be more options. So yeah, there are also other videos in my channel about determinism that I've linked. So hopefully you can watch them, and if you realize that from a deterministic point that there is no free will, you'd realize that the heaven and hell concept doesn't make any sense. So yeah, that's essentially why I'm an atheist. Also, like, the biblical flood didn't happen. Moses didn't exist. I think most of the biblical characters up to, I don't know if it's Solomon, didn't exist. So yeah, that's just food for thought. But I'm glad I finally got to make this video, and I'll make a part 2 if you guys have any questions in the comments addressing them. I kind of didn't rehearse, I just made the video off the cuff. So hopefully it turns out well.